Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in 1 Kings chapter 9, and Solomon has dedicated the temple. The 7-year construction of the temple is completed. He dedicated the temple with a glorious manifestation of God's presence and an extremely long prophetic prayer. Even though and the prayer itself was very interesting because he is praying for mercy, and I don't know if he prophetically saw the future, because he is a part of that mercy himself, as we will see that he himself will violate God's commandments. We'll see that in just a couple of chapters, and certainly the entirety of First and Second Kings, we will see what he prayed was certainly needed, praying for God's mercy. And so he prays that when they are conquered and deported to other lands, and when they are from the other lands, if they see God, if they pray to God and say, Lord, hear our prayer. Lord, hear our prayer. Have mercy on us. And then we're going to see, you will see that God is going to have mercy on him, right? You will see that this mercy, okay? He says, now when we fall into famine, when we fall into severe drought, plagues because of our sins, and and Israel comes to their senses, he says, be merciful. And so God, this is prophetic, and we're going to see this. Actually, reading through it will be frustrating, because it was almost like, when would these people learn, right? When would these people learn? And it's like they never learn. And if you even think about this, even to this very day, Israel has not learned. Israel as a nation is cut off from God. They have no relationship with God. In fact, Israel is more liberal than the United States. One of the most liberal nations on the planet, not following the commands of God. It's like they just never learned. But anyway, so Solomon prays this prayer, and then here is God's response to his prayer. It says, verse 9. It says, when Solomon finished building the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all that Solomon desired to do. So this is about 20 years since he's mentioning both of them. The temple took 7 years, and his palace 13 years. His palace was a lot bigger because it was his palace, his dwelling place, as well as sort of his throne room. So, so it's kind of like Silly Hall. Verse 2, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, just as he appeared to him at Gibeon, and said to him, I have heard your prayer and petitions you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple you have built to put my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there at all times. As for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, with a heart of integrity and in what is right, doing everything I've commanded you, and if you keep my statute and ordinance. Let me say one thing, because you constantly see this about David. Solomon prayed it, and that is justice. And I'm going to say, not even America has lived up to the term justice. If you think about how hard it is for us to fight for what just justice, okay? And so David, during David's time, he was a king that justice. If you lived under David's rulership, there was justice, there was fairness. You felt that. Okay. Verse 5, he says, I will establish your royal throne of Israel forever. As I promised your father David, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. Now notice this. Well, look at verse 6. Now, if you or your sons turn away from following me and do not keep my commandments, and by the way, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we will kind of see from that perspective. And they will not, he says, but if you do not, he says, my statute, read verse 6 again. If you or your sons turn away from following me and do not keep my commandments, my statutes that I have set before you, and if you go and serve other gods and worship them, and they will, repeatedly, I will cut off Israel from the land I gave them, and I will reject the temple I have sanctified for my name, and Israel will become an object of scorn and ridicule among all the peoples. And this will happen about 500 years from this point of this statement here, that the temple through or by Nebuchadnezzar will be completely destroyed. He says, though this temple is now exalted and everyone who passed by will be appalled and mocked, they will say, why did the Lord do this? Why did the Lord do this to this land and to this temple? Then they will say, because they've abandoned the Lord and their God who brought their ancestors out of the land of Egypt. They clung to other gods and worshipped and served them. Because of this, the Lord brought all of this ruin on them. And this is the sad testimony of Israel. That this is the sad testimony of Israel. And it is interesting that this is where he leaves off. This is where God leaves off saying, because this is their testimony. As I said, even to this day, right now, they are cut off. And every opportunity that God has given them. The Old Testament, and again, this is to the Christians' shame, have allowed the framework. When they say the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, God is a God of wrath. And the way that comes out, they make it seem as though God is just kind of sitting up there on his throne, just like looking for a reason. Go ahead, make my day. But they do not go in to say, well, why is this wrath coming? Now keep this in mind, that it will take nearly 1,000 years. Now remember, when you start from Egypt, the mighty hand of God that delivered Israel from the mightiest nation at the time, Egypt, nearly broke the nation. Within a year, remember they made the golden calf. I'm sorry, it was 3 months. I'm sorry, about 3 months, right? In the 3rd month, they made the golden calf and said, let this calf lead us back to the bondage. And from that time to the Babylonian Empire, basically what you see is they repeatedly sinned against God, followed pagan worship, and in some cases acted worse than the pagan nations. And you kind of have to understand that the world at the time was incredibly pagan, sinful, wicked. During the flood, the reason for the flood was because of the incredible wickedness. As God says, they were continually wicked, with wicked thoughts, continually, all the time. All the time. In other words, violence, right? When we think about the immorality that we see today, and we go, oh my God, how terrible a thing this is. It was 1,000,000 times worse during Noah's time. So if you think rape, incest, murder, right? It was worse then. So And yet here they will continually to do this, and they would continually fall into God's wrath. So when people, what is more of a testimony is that how merciful God is repeatedly, now get this, for this 1,000 years. So when people say, oh, God is the God of wrath, yeah, because of how wicked his people were, continually over and over and over and over again. Okay, so verse 10 said that at the end of 20 years, during which Solomon had built the two houses, the Lord's temple and his royal palace. So it's like he built the temple first, then he built his palace. Okay, and we're going to see a little more about how how spectacular this was later. Verse 11: Hiram, king of Tyre, having supplied him with cedars and cypress logs and gold for his every wish, King Solomon gave Hiram 20 towns in the land of Galilee. So now this is funny right here, because 20 towns, right? So Hiram went out from Tyre to look over the towns that Solomon had given him, but he was not pleased with him, and so he said, what are these towns you're giving me, my brother? So he called them Kabul, as they are still called today. Now Hiram sent the king 900 pounds of gold. Now, again, this is amazing. So here you have Solomon, and we kind of see that Solomon in his wisdom was also shrewd and kind of ruthless right here. In other words, Hiram was a good friend and said, here, take these 20 kings. Now, I'm not going to mention any cities because, granted, it could be insulting. But I could just imagine. Now, I live in the Chicago area, and if I said, hey, I can give you I can list 20 extremely bad cities that would just be insulting someone to say, hey, you can have these towns. And you would go, this is what you're giving me? Like I say, I'm not going to mention any names, but if you all just think about your area and go, wow, this is what you're giving me. Thanks, right? Gee, thanks. It'd be like the poorest areas. Maybe I'll talk about it'd be like giving like a lot of towns in the Appalachian area. The Appalachian region. Like, really? This is what you're giving me? Okay. All right. Verse 15. This is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon had imposed to build the Lord's temple, his own palace, and the supporting terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazar, Megiddo, Gezer. 16. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had attacked and captured Gezer. He then burned it down, killed the Canaanites who lived in that city, and gave it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. Now remember, when you would make these marriages, this is not a godly marriage, but so the other side of this is the purpose of doing this is alliances, okay? So, for example, Gezer didn't have an alliance. Well, they got destroyed, okay? Verse 17, then Solomon rebuilt Gezer, Lower Beth Haran, Belath, Tamar in the wilderness of Judah, all the storage cities that belonged to Solomon, the chariot cities, cavalry cities, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, Lebanon, and anywhere else in the land of his dominion. So we kind of see this entire building of Solomon here, the establishing of his cities, even though it was a time of peace. He really never needed it, but somewhat anyway. But it was an impressive army. Notice these cities were armies. He was stationing the armies. But one of the things, and I'm going to get to later, is the forced labor that he enacted to build his cities. And we're going to see the cost, the highly cost, the burdensome cost of that later. Verse 20. As for the people who remained of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not Israelites, their descendants who remained in the land after them, those whom the Israelites were unable to completely destroy, Solomon imposed forced labor on them. It is that way until this day. Now, remember I said that the dating of the writing of this here, it's certainly telling us here that it's before the Babylonian exile. When it's not sure, but anyway, because we don't know who wrote these letters, these books, and certainly they are being written after the events here. So this is, they're looking back in history. And it seemed like sometimes doing the kings, someone from this period, someone from this kind of time, I would say, well, the kings goes all the way to the Babylonian exile. So whoever's writing this, I would say, is somebody up until around that period of time. It is possible that it could have been even during the Babylonian Empire. But at this point, again, remember, everything that they're reporting here will be completely destroyed. All right, verse 22. But Solomon did not consign the Israelites to slavery. I know it's a sore spot for people. Slavery was quite common. If you were weak, more than likely, you became a slave unless you forged a alliance with someone. He says, but Solomon did not consign the Israelites to slavery. They were soldiers, his servants, his commanders, his captains, and his commanders of his chariots, of his cavalry. These were deputies who were over Solomon's work, 550 who ruled over the people doing the work. Okay. Verse 24. Pharaoh's daughter moved from the city of David to the house that Solomon had built for her, and then he built the terraces. So not a bad place for her. In other words, he didn't dwell, in a sense, in the Israelites' camp, but she had a pretty nice palace, and I emphasize palace, okay? So probably mentally she wasn't, down with the Jews anyway. But she did marry David as an alliance. Solomon as an alliance. Verse 25. 3 times a year Solomon offered three times a year Solomon offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings at the altar that he had built for the Lord, and he burned incense with them in the Lord's presence. So he completed the temple. King Solomon put together a fleet of ships at Gibber, which is near Eloth, on the shores of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom. With the fleet, Hiram sent his servants, experienced seamen, along with Solomon's servants, and they went to Ophir, and acquired gold there 16 tons and delivered them to Solomon. So you see the incredible wealth that he had amassed. We're going to get another reporting of this, where these ships would go out on these 5-year journeys, kind of like Star Trek. Remember, if you look at the original Star Trek, they went on a 5-year mission out in the universe. Well, Solomon's, they would go out on these 3-year journeys, and they would just collect things, and he's going to give it a kind of a detailed accounting of it: gold, silver, all kinds of animals, all kinds of things that he's going to acquire. Quite impressive, right? Quite impressive. Alright guys, look, don't forget to like and share this video. Hit that subscribe button. Share these videos. Subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. Share your comments. All comments are welcome. See you in the next study.